What's up, y'all? You tuned in to Trigger Radio every Friday. Pioneers Valley's home of hip-hop, music, culture, politics, and education. It's Brother Chris cooling out with you, and we have a very special guest, University of Chicago graduate student Tanji Gilliam. We're going to talk about her work with hip-hop, the Black Youth Project, and some other things related to hip-hop in the media, representation of women. So how you doing out there?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. So I wanted to just give folks an idea of some of the work that you've been involved with, and I'll just read basically your bio. Tanji Gilliam is a fifth-year PhD student at the History of Culture program at the University of Chicago. She received her MA in History of Culture in 2002 and an MFA in Film, Video, and New Media from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in 2006. Her dissertation project and documentary project is entitled That Crack in the Concrete, Hip-Hop, History, and Politics in Black Urban Video Culture. She was also an organizer of the Hip Hop and Feminism Conference at the University of Chicago in 2006. She's taught courses on hip hop to youth from Philadelphia, Chicago, Trenton, New Jersey, and she's currently a 10th grade English teacher at Cardozo Senior High School in Washington, D.C. She's also a mother of 2 sons and artistic director of Oil House Productions, a multimedia production company. So, as you can see, we have a very distinguished guest, and want to pick her brain a little bit about.
Thank you.
Yeah, so it's good to finally catch up with you and have you on our show.
Here.
So maybe we could start off by just talking about how you got into hip hop. I mean, everybody has their own point of origin story, and kind of like when they first realized that hip hop had the power to change people's attitudes and minds, and also using hip hop as an educational tool. So what was that moment for you?
Absolutely. I mean, I have very few childhood memories, but one of my earliest memories of hip hop, and when I can say I definitely got into hip hop, is I can remember sitting on my porch in New Jersey listening to my mom playing tricks on me. That's like one of my earliest memories, and to this day, I credit like Scarface as one of my favorite MCs. Like, that constant question, who are your top 5 dead or alive? He's definitely up there. And I guess maybe that's one of the reasons why that song impressed me so much.
Mm-hmm.
So my point of entry really in hip-hop was as a fan initially. You know what I mean? Like growing up listening to hip-hop, growing up trying to be an MC, and just being very involved with the culture from like a fan standpoint and an artist sort of wannabe standpoint. But intellectually and professionally, my entry point into hip-hop was as a scholar. I started doing undergraduate research on the culture and then started doing conference organizing. So the work that I did at the Hip Hop and Feminism Conference out in Chicago was definitely sort of, not by accident or whatever. I had organized one at Penn, which is where I went for undergrad, and, just started getting involved teaching courses on hip-hop to young people, high school age at Penn as well. The first class I taught on hip-hop was with the Upward Bound program in Philly. So, it started as a fan and then developed into sort of a research project and, a book project in the works.
And, I mean, talk about the origins of your dissertation work. I mean, a lot of it is based on your personal experiences teaching hip-hop. But kind of give an overview of what, people will expect in your dissertation project. This is a very provocative title, I think.
Oh, thank you. Well, my dissertation project grew out of music video and other cultural video moments that hip-hop critiques. So really, more than any other video, the one that impacted me the most was the alleged R. Kelly tape and conversations that were happening about this video inside of hip-hop culture, but then just in Black public culture, period. It grew out of a lack of conversation from feminists about the video, and so it definitely has a feminist orientation. And I was wondering why more Black women and more Black feminists in particular were not speaking about that video in ways that were, growing out of a sort of healthy conversation about sexual politics inside of the hip-hop generation. So, why was everyone's interest in the tape sort of this? Because, people were definitely talking about the tape, but why were people's interest in the tape sort of this conversation about, was it R. Kelly or not? or were the girls underage or not, this kind of thing, as opposed to saying, here's a moment where we definitely have an opportunity to talk about sexual molestation inside of the hip-hop generation, inside of the black community. For me, and for a lot of people, hip-hop has always been black culture, So I use hip-hop very much as a springboard to talk about, like, what's going on inside of contemporary black urban culture, My angle is videos. That's one thing that I'm most passionate about. But it just became interesting to me with the R. Kelly video that, around the same time, people were talking about the Nelly video, and there was a conversation forming about, what rappers were doing in terms of their sexual politics and what they were not doing, right? But we couldn't manage to bridge a larger conversation about black people in general and just, the sexual health of the black community at that moment. It's like, whenever something happens inside of hip-hop, everyone just wants to point the finger at rappers and pretend like it's just music. Mm-hmm. So, the agents of hip-hop culture are always just the artists, and the rap artists specifically. But we know that hip-hop is larger than that, and it's broader than that. So it's about using these video moments as a springboard to talk about, black urban culture.
And it's interesting that you mentioned the R. Kelly tape because, I guess being in Chicago at that time, R. Kelly has a tremendous following.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. He's from Chicago. He went to Kenwood High School, which is a high school that I've done work inside of. And, they have love for R. Kelly in Chicago, serious love. You know what I mean? There was one DJ there, and I'm forgetting his name at this point, but there was one DJ who took him off the airwaves, but that was for about 2 weeks or something before it all blew over, and then his music was back up, But once again, for me, it was about the attitudes and the perception of what was important to talk about with regarding that tape. We couldn't talk about sexual molestation. We couldn't talk about statutory rape and even get clear about defining, what is statutory rape and what is not. What is the nature of consent regarding statutory rape? Because we didn't want to have that conversation. Everybody was more interested in talking about, well, is it R. Kelly or not? And did the little girls on the tape want it or not? It was like that became the conversation, like, almost a given that it was consensual sex. So it was really just about these video moments. One of the things that I did was to go through the Source magazine as a primary document, right, and look at it from 1989 to 2004, and look at every issue of the Source and pull out these video moments that hip-hop was clearly interested in. So it included, obviously, the R. Kelly tape, but in addition to that, it included things like, the police beating of Rodney King. It included a host of music videos that were, brought into national sort of media attention, including things like the Nelly video, right, but also Public Enemy's By the Time I Get to Arizona, and, the Sprite commercials that KRS-One was absolutely livid about, you know what I mean? So, like, all kinds of, moments in which, Mackenzie River and Chuck D, these video moments that you get attached to for brief periods of time, that in my opinion are signal moments to talk about what are the politics of this generation. Where's the nationalist politics? Where's the feminist politics? Where, could we institute more progressive politics inside of this generation as talking points around these videos?
Mm-hmm. One of the things we've been trying to track down is the way in which the industry basically provides a platform for certain representations of black culture, black youth in particular, and particularly around this issue of sex and sexuality. Part of the study that you had been a part of really identified the fact that there's so many videos that are played on BET, and 80% of them have sexual content, and so how that plays into people's behaviors and youth behaviors. And talk about that a little bit, because I think it's one thing to look at the artist, and I think that's been a convenient scapegoat for a lot of people. But how does your study address the industry aspect of it in terms of who's actually funding these type of images and why those images predominate over other?
Oh, absolutely. I'm so glad you asked that question. First, I want to give a sort of nod to Kathy Cohen, who's the project director of the Black Youth Project at University of Chicago. It's really growing now. And when we started that project, it came out of the perception that black youth are watching 3+ hours of music videos a day. That's an insane number of videos. If you consider the fact that our project age, half of them, over half of them actually, are in school age. So when they come home from school, after school, 3 hours a day, on average, are devoted to music video programming. So a large part of what we had to do was get inside what happens inside of these music videos. And you're absolutely right. BET, MTV, they have an investment in promoting damaging sexual representations to young people. They do. It sells. It helps further sell the music. So the recording industry is obviously a part of this as well, not just the music television industry, right? But we know they're one and the same. I mean, Viacom has a lot of that on lock, right? So in addressing these damaging effects that music videos can have on black youth and young adults, we didn't want to make any assumptions, right? So we decided, okay, they're watching it. We know they're watching it. There were, the Me study out of Philadelphia proved that they were watching it. Random CNN-type studies, that polled audiences proved that they were watching it. So what type of effects are coming, out of this group of people that are watching 3+ hours of music videos? And at the end of the day, we know what the content is. We know that, they have no problem presenting simulated sex inside of music videos. We know that they have no problem creating markets like uncut markets or Playboy TV markets and all these other sort of late night, markets that are exposed to children. You don't have to purchase these channels, right? Maybe Playboy TV you do. You don't have to purchase BET Uncut when it was on. So we know that there's no sort of barrier that young children have in between, adult content inside of these videos. And so the industry knows that it's helpful, but also, and here, and I don't want everything to fall onto the industry either. Here we know that, older, adult black males are making decisions to let this type of content be exposed to younger people also. And I don't want to make it seem as though there's no place for sexual activity inside of black culture. That's not it at all, right? We know that what we need is a diversity of representation. That's what hip-hop has been lacking. We don't have more progressive, and not until very recently anyway, did we even have like VH1 Soul or, I see BET Jazz has their own sort of VH1 Soul knockoff now. But we need more markets for other types of images coming out of hip-hop specifically. It shouldn't have to reach out to soul and then have a couple hip-hop videos on it. You know what I mean? We need other markets for hip-hop videos and for progressive artists that we know are in hip-hop to be able to disseminate their music as well.
I think you raised some very interesting points about the kind of interplay between people, the artists themselves, and the industry, not letting either off the hook. I'm wondering if you can extend that and talk about the decisions that female artists make in being depicted in one way, and then talk about the artists that you've come across, that female artists that really go against the grain and try to present a more healthy image in the media, and talk about some of the effects that their career has had on you, or their ability to basically market themselves.
Right, and of course, in my opinion, again, inside of the top 5 MCs that are alive is Lauryn Hill. And if we look at her career and what she was trying to do with miseducation, we see examples of ways in which both the hip-hop niche inside of the industry, but then also the recording industry in general, just sort of beats down upon female MCs inside of the game. I think that if you look at an album like Miseducation, for one of the things that me off about that album is just that everyone was trying to debate whether or not it was a hip-hop album. So if it's an artist like Andre, right, from Outkast, who's trying to push Outkast in the direction of including elements of soul, including elements of R&B inside of a rap recording, we have no problem deciding that that's a hip-hop album, right? But Miseducation, I Can't Stand the Rain, all these, Super Duper Fly, Missy Elliott's first album. These albums don't even get picked up in the stores as, hip-hop albums and reviewed. They're reviewed as alternative albums. So I think that one of the things that happens with really dynamic women who have always had a presence inside of hip-hop culture, Mary J. Blige, people like this, is that we're not willing to push the boundaries of what is hip-hop and what is not hip-hop to extend and embrace female artists, right? So it's okay to be a hook girl inside of hip-hop. So somebody like Chiquita, right, from Wu-Tang, or just, all these people who have already influenced what we consider to be dynamic hip-hop albums. Okay, yeah, but they're really just R&B singers. And that's what happened with Lauren, who was a fierce MC, you know what I mean? And we knew that. But she puts out an album like Miseducation. It's like, we always knew she was just an R&B girl. And so she gets, sort of put further marginalized inside of hip-hop culture, right? So that's one thing that happens. But then for artists that are strictly rap artists, right? So Bahamadia, Jean Grey, artists that are, really producing incredible lyricism inside of hip-hop, then it's like we have ways in which we don't know how to market those artists. So if you talk to Bahamadia, Jean Grey, I don't know if you've seen, there's this girl out of Philly, I forget her name, but she has this really dynamic documentary on hip-hop women, right? Women in hip-hop. And there's a scene in there where Bahamadia, she spits fire, first of all, for at least 20, 30 bars or whatever, constant, nonstop, just spitting. Then the interview with her shows how beat down she is, you know what I mean, and how tired she is of trying to put out work inside of an industry that's just not loving her back for the talented MC that she is. Jean Grey, when in essence did their Take Back the Music series, I saw her on a panel, and she speaks a similar sort of art, and this is right after, Jean Grey puts out her album, and, the 1 week, is the 1 week or this week, that album, and she's talking about, really important stuff inside of this album. She's talking about, feminist issues, but she's also just talking about being a woman, you know what I mean? On singles where she's talking about stuff like, just the reality that she hasn't yet given birth to a child, and making that into an important rap record for women like me anyway, or just people who are interested in hearing something new inside of hip-hop. You know what I mean? Talking about this reality that, friends of hers around her are giving birth to children and she hasn't yet given birth to children. That's an important message. It's something new that I want to hear come out of hip-hop, And she put out this album and just didn't get love back for it. You know what I mean? Just did not get love back for it. So what do you do with an industry that says, okay, if you're cute, we can find a way to market you, but you have to water down your material. You can't come with fire because nobody's expecting that outside of it. A female, it's from a female MC. Or worse, if you are a female MC, like a Rod Digga, for instance, right, we want to give you props, but you have to have an entire male army put you out, or at least one male. We saw this in the case of Foxy Brown, we saw this in the case of Little Kim and Big, you know what I mean? You have to have at least one male that's already established in the game be the one to sort of put you out. That doesn't do well for females' careers. We've seen that happen over and over again. Okay, yeah, they put us out, but as soon as they, don't have the first run inside of the spotlight, then what happens to me? You know what I mean? If I'm not being carried by this male artist, then where's my venue? Where's my microphone? But that being said, I think that there are really some tremendous female MCs inside of the underground, and I think that they're really tremendous MCs on the margins of that commercial market as well. One of the things I love about hip-hop is that it's not at all different from any other black movement inside of America ever, right? So just like the Civil Rights Movement, just like the Black Power Movement, there are females out there on an activist end really doing tremendous work in hip-hop. They're scholars, they're activists, they're journalists. 90% of what, in my opinion, is really hot coming out of these major hip-hop publications are by female journalists. So it's like we have women there doing work inside of hip-hop, but they just, constantly get marginalized.
If you're just joining us, this is Trigger Radio, 103.3 FM WXOJ in Northampton, Massachusetts. We're sitting down right now with Tangi Gilliam, who's a PhD student and author of a very provocative study on hip-hop and politics, focused around black youth and politics, which comes out of the Black Youth Project in Chicago. I wanted to ask you if artists were a part of the surveys that went out, And the reason why I ask that is because there seems to be a yearning, if you will, for more political or politically conscious artistic forms from consumers, from young people, who've identified, hey, these are some of the issues that we want to address. Possibly the music can serve to help us, get these messages out. But I wonder what the attitude of some of the artists that you've come across has been. What's been the reception amongst artists? And do you feel that young people's voices really influence what the artists produce, or is it more or less industry driven? I got to do what I got to do to get my record out.
Well, we know everything that's industry driven, right, is driven by the people too, to a certain extent. Yes, there are, ways in which just cultures of hegemony have impacted the industry such that there is racism inside the industry. So even if, the masses of black people suddenly decided that they wanted to promote artists like Common or Talib Kweli, that would not happen necessarily. It certainly would not happen overnight. It would happen, but it would take a great deal of effort on our part, and it would happen for a long-term vision of hip-hop. It would not happen immediately. There would be a lot of resistance to that kind of move. But in terms of whether or not the survey that we worked on with the Black Youth Project addressed artists specifically, it did so as a secondary motive. So one of the things we were interested in when we called, because it was a random survey of black youth across America, right? And it also used it did survey some white youth and Latino youth also, but it just wasn't the focus of the survey. And so one of the questions we asked are you an MC? Are you a DJ? Are you a breakdancer? We wanted to know, get a sense for what the numbers were for hip-hop cultural participants across America. I'm not a social scientist, unfortunately, so when the survey results came back in, whatever was published in terms of those numbers was what was available to me as a humanist. Okay. But you can certainly contact the survey instrument coordinator and find out what those numbers, what those percentages of those people were across America. But we know they're there, right? We know that inside of the underground, there are artists that are being, surveyed inside of this medium. The project that I worked on for my dissertation project did interview artists specifically. And so I asked, a host of these questions to artists like Boots Riley, for instance, of The Coup, to Beverly Bond, of course, a DJ outside of New York, to other underground artists that don't get as much attention, right? So to Rockefeller, who's a breakdancer out of New York and has her own company with her husband, Quickstep, who you may have heard of as well, through Full Circle Soul out of New York. So I went to artists through that project. I interviewed Dr. Roxanne Sante, for instance, former artist for that project.
And one of the things that I've been interested in, and our show has been interested in, is really looking at grassroots media. I mean, part of your study looks at internet usage as well. I'm wondering if you've, been privy to a lot of the nuanced attempts to get more independent artists out, such as through podcasts or through internet radio. And I want to know what your experience with that has been.
Well, I think that there are a ton of artists, right, who use independent means of producing albums, right, selling themselves individually, selling their music individually. But I think Chuck D was one of probably the most earliest prominent examples of someone who was willing to take his music onto the web and, really do the business of promoting that medium for other artists. And so if you think about the fact that, we found each other on MySpace, that's, one venue right there, that's free and accessible to the public for artists to distribute their music. But in terms of grassroots moving of music, as long as we're also paralleling that with grassroots activism, right? So Malcolm X grassroots movement inside of New York is doing some really important things. And then they're able then to put together a summer concert like Black August, right? And have artists like Dead Prez and also, even more mainstream artists, Common, Talib, rep the stage for that sort of grassroots audience outside of, some major produced concert or whatever. I think that if you consider even just what blogs have done for politicizing a generation, finding their avenue, not just to to produce their music, right, but to produce their voice in any means, right? So to write about political images, to write about, sort of their necessity for seeing better representations of themselves inside of any stream, inside of the mainstream, inside of the underground. So blogs, internet, just producing your albums independently. Black people are creative people. We've found these avenues, and now it's just I would like to see more of a desire inside of MCs to produce Black-owned productions for the sake of producing Black-owned productions, not for the sake of blowing up. You know what I mean? To not just to have that same hustle and that same grind while they're waiting for record deals.
In terms of the Black Youth Project, it's based in Chicago, and we had talked before about the Chicago hip-hop scene. And I know you're in D.C. now, but you spent a lot of time in Chicago. And one of the things that you're pointing out is the way in which graffiti culture, as part of hip-hop, is really the dominant element. But we also know that nationally, graffiti is this space that's being more commodified and also criminalized. So let's talk about that in terms of, on the one hand, representing a core aspect of hip-hop culture and then being demonized on the other.
Right, absolutely. It's an excellent question. I've lived in a couple different cities, right? I've lived in Philadelphia for 4 years. I've lived in Chicago for about 4.5 years, and now I'm in D.C. And I was really pleased inside of Chicago to see the fact that graffiti is the dominant element there. That doesn't mean that Black young people are not as invested in rap music as they are, across the country. It just means that when it comes down to like underground, independent hip-hop artists inside of Chicago, you're talking about a graffiti culture that really rivals many other cities. And so one of the things that I did for my dissertation project was to interview the artist Dwell, who's a graffiti artist out of Chicago. And the way in which he put it to me was that, at one point, graffiti culture, especially in more liberal areas of the city, like Hyde Park, for instance, which is a neighborhood in Chicago that borders the university, but it's also, sort of akin to scholars and intellectuals and artists across the city. But we're able to put up graffiti murals without any beef from the cops, so there wasn't this culture of vandalism, for instance, that Giuliani created for graffiti inside of New York, or, it wasn't as much of a problem until recently, but police, connecting to sort of growing gang developments inside of hip-hop culture to that graffiti movement, and they just started shutting it down, right? So completely licensed places like Graffiti Alley in Hyde Park, where people at one point, graffiti artists at one point, had no problem putting up murals without, any sort of interaction with the cops, completely licensed place. We're starting to be arrested for putting up murals. And so there are still spaces that go untouched by police presence, right? Lakeith Raven is a sort of pioneer graffiti artist inside of Chicago, and he also teaches in the high schools. And he's managed to carve out a couple bridge murals in spaces where his crew can constantly put up murals there. But anything that gets too big inside of hip-hop, we know is a threat to dominant cultures. And Chicago PD, like police departments in every other city across America, is a dominant force inside of Chicago. And so I think that they got wind of the nature of Black creativity and Latino creativity that is present inside of the graffiti culture in Chicago, and just found ways to shut it down, found ways to connect it to gang cultures where, unlike DC, for instance, the city I live in now, graffiti murals are murals in Chicago. They're not tags. They're not gang tags, right? And yes, of course, there's still ways to rep your hood, and yes, of course, there are still ways to rep yourself, but they're not, just explicit markers of gang turf inside of Chicago. And so despite that, they just connected it with gang cultures, just like police departments do, across the country. One of the most interesting finds I've had as a scholar is this Department of Justice handbook that they created about, ways in which to crack down on vandalism inside the city in general, but graffiti is a real threat to the Department of Justice. They have an instituted manual that says, okay, this is how graffiti is connected to gang culture, therefore graffiti is a threat to us. Mm-hmm. It doesn't operate that way in every single city. It doesn't operate that way in every single hood. But, cops are cops, and they're not going to take the amount of time to, differentiate between what this graffiti mural means, right? And we know that graffiti murals are coded languages, right? But, whereas in a city like DC, they can recognize certain tags and, be correct. I work in schools, so I see these kind of tags all the time. Be correct in assuming, okay, that's representative of this type of gang activity or that's representative of this type of gang activity. No, not in Chicago. Chicago graffiti murals are like graffiti murals in the purest, most beautiful sense of them, and they're really, those artists really need to be commended for the work that they do, not locked up for it.
It's real interesting too because you have people who, like I know a couple cats who are actually having charges brought against them. Like the city built a file, taking pictures of the tags, and are applying felony charges against graffiti artists. And so it's real interesting. On the one hand, you have people getting felony charges, and on the other hand, you got people designing clothes, and so there's one form there's one form that's acceptable, and but they're missing the point about reclaiming urban space and what that actually means for a lot of youth, because that's one of the elements that I really grew up in too, is the graffiti culture out in California. And since then, it's just been, for me, part and parcel of what we consider hip-hop culture, even though when I was 10 years old, I didn't really know what that was about. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, as somebody who grew up on the East Coast, Chicago was my first city, that really embraced that West Coast love for the other hip-hop elements. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? It's not so much a breakdancing city, you know what I mean? But what I did realize when I visited Chicago was that hip-hop is a culture for real out there. It's not this sort of East Coast rap band. It's not this sort of Southern region rap band that we see presently inside of hip-hop culture. No, hip-hop is like a really dynamic, multifaceted culture. And Chicago gave love to that angle from the graffiti bit, But in terms of the police presence and how, they're constantly involved in sort of hip-hop aesthetics, there are all these sort of non-mainstream cases, graffiti artists who get locked up for putting up tags or for putting up murals. We see, things like DJ Drama down in Atlanta, right? This sort of, the feds seized all of his equipment, you know what I mean, for putting out mixtapes. And that's real, you know what I mean? Like, and yes, Drama's case did get a little bit more attention, than you see. But it certainly wasn't like an artist getting shot, you know what I mean? Or it certainly wasn't like a rap artist getting locked up, which we know rap artists sometimes do just for publicity stunts, you know what I mean? But we have these real cases being brought on to hip-hop artists of all different mediums for what they do, for the art that they produce. And that's a real sort of indication of hyper-surveillance of black people inside of these urban communities. It's a real sort of subset of that. But it's also this idea that, hip-hop as a voice of marginalized youth is a threat to a lot of different industries. And the sort of justice industry, if you will, is just one of many of those arenas.
I want to turn for a second to something you mentioned, you hinted at in your last response, and that was Black and Latino youth. And one of the things we've been looking at on the West Coast particularly is this kind of proliferation of antagonism between these two groups. And, I don't know if it's hard to judge what's going on everywhere else, but I just want to know from your experiences, and maybe you could use Chicago or Philly as a case in point, but what is the relationship between Black and Latino youth? I mean, even within hip-hop culture, we have this idea of possible solidarity or potential solidarity, and then we see that kind of erode at different points. And I want to know what your experience has been with that, and if people who are planning the study with the Black youth really entertain those ideas of solidarity between ethnic groups who are both marginalized.
Yeah, well, I'll speak first to the project. We certainly entertain this idea of a focused study of Black people inside of America, but we know that gets slippery. So one of the things we had to do was assign a scholar onto the project who really try to make sense of what does this terminology Black mean? Who all does that include? If you think about someone like activist Rosa Clemente, right, who's very interested in the idea that as a Puerto Rican woman, she's a Black woman. You know what I mean? We see this come up often inside of Latino communities inside of New York. Right, this willingness to say, because of common oppressions, because of the common, legacy of slavery inside of our communities, Black as a term is embracive enough of both, cultures, right? However, I think that we need to do more work, right, period, particularly as educators of high school age youth, in educating people about the history of marginalized people in this country, period. And then when you do that, Latino youth will no longer be just a term that everyone kind of throws around, right? So as a teacher inside of D.C., I teach, everybody basically who's intensely marginalized and thrown into the school I teach. Like, I don't want to be funny, there, but the reality of it is that I teach the margins of the margins. So when when the juvenile justice complexes that they have inside of D.C. break down and break up or reshuffle their folks, they come to Cardozo, right? But in a school like what I work in, the students think that if you are Latina inside of this school, that means that you're Puerto Rican, So, of course, all of my students who are Guatemalan, who are Colombian, are like, but wait a minute, no, I am Latina, but, you know what I mean? I'm not... I'm not Puerto Rican, so we need to do a better job as Black people, and as educators, no matter where we are, and educating folks on, what that institution of slavery really was, on the one hand, and that the fact that it was not just a U.S. institution, right, that there were slaveholding states in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, hell, in Brazil, you know what I mean? We need to be firm in sort of educating about, what the legacy of Black has really been, as a sort of diasporic or, multinational sense of the word. And then also, we just need to do a better job of recognizing the fact that these communities of color inside of cities, the world over, and hell, inside the suburbs the world over, are communities of color that are differentiated along a lot of national lines. You know what I mean? And we're dealing with a lot of first-generation communities inside of the hip-hop generation. And, obviously that does not just incorporate African-American people.
I wanted to also ask you about using hip-hop in the classroom, because educators, I remember KRS used to say, people who grew up in hip-hop are going to be taking hip-hop wherever they go in society. So that means if you become, God forbid, if you become a police officer or if you become the judge or if you become, whatever you become, you're taking hip-hop. You don't really lose it. And so
absolutely,
one of the places that a lot of people who grew up in hip-hop have begun to take hip-hop is into the classroom, especially into the universities, but also into high schools, and begin to develop curricula around around hip-hop culture. And I want to know what your experience with that has been. Give some examples possibly of how you've used hip-hop in the classroom and what the response of the students has been, because a lot of policymakers and school principals will shun the idea that hip-hop can be used as an educational tool. So really kind of talk about your experience with that.
Right. As a scholar that was sort of developed inside of the academy, right, capital A Academy, I can say that in terms of college classrooms, there's always been a resistance to hip-hop as curriculum, particularly because there's been a resistance to hip-hop as a viable sort of dissertation project for young scholars, right? So there's all kinds of resistance there. However, what I've appreciated now as I've gone on and started a career as a scholar inside of high schools, there's the adverse reaction, right? It's quite the opposite. Principals of Black high schools across the country are more willing to put hip hop into or at least to integrate hip hop into the school curriculum. And it could because they recognize, they're on hand with black youth, and therefore they recognize that hip-hop has the power to affirm the identity of black and Latino youth inside of these schools. It just does, you know what I mean? So it helps to make them feel good about themselves. It helps to get them interested in their own learning. It helps to connect ideas that they're trying to implement anyway inside of a high school curriculum to the ability to learn and the ability to advance with their students. So that's their primary concern. If it affirms students enough to help them to learn, then there's a place for hip-hop inside of high schools. So I would credit Elizabeth Kirby inside of Chicago. That's someone who, was educated at Harvard but decided that I'm going to become a principal at a urban school, and I'm going to let, what I learned inside the academy filter into validating young people. I credit people like Dr. James Peterson, who has used hip-hop inside of the academy to reach out to young people in Philly. You know what I mean? I just think that, hip-hop, like most other black sort of leftist big cultures, have been very wary of institution building, right? Institutions in our mind are the equivalent of the man, right? So instituting hip-hop inside the academy, we're suspect of that. Instituting hip-hop inside of the public school system, we're suspect of that because we know that there have been all sorts of detrimental effects that universities have had on urban neighborhoods, and there have been all sorts of effects, of course, that the public school system has had on black and Latino young people, right? But hip-hop has got to commit itself to institution building. One of the best ways of doing that is through education, you know what I mean? And through using our tools as scholars or our tools as activists, our tools as artists inside of urban communities to reach out to public school youth inside of these communities. And when you do that, you touch a lot of people. Like, I teach, I'm on maternity leave right now, but I normally teach 100 students a day. So if you just look at that right there in terms of ways in which you can build and sort of reshape political attitudes and, sexual attitudes and behaviors of young people through hip-hop, that's doing good work. That's doing a lot of work. And I'm going to teach 100 new students next year. So, when you think about it that way, you really just have to, commit yourself as, like you said, as a fan of hip-hop, as a participant of hip-hop, if you're an artist, if you're a scholar, hell, if you're a DJ, on the radio or on wax, whatever you do inside of hip-hop or outside of hip-hop as a fan, you need to commit yourself to some kind of institution building. My dream goal is to open up a culture art center. That's what Oil House Productions is all about, right? One day I want Oil House. I want a space that commits itself to using hip-hop and all other varieties of black culture and black aesthetics to empower young people. And that means, affirming who they are as people. It means teaching them to be educators, right, to reach back into other folks inside of their community, commit themselves in some aspect of their lives to that. But like you said, to use hip-hop in anything you do, to build institutions. That's why I brought up the point about underground artists and how I wish they use that same grind, that same hustle all throughout their careers. There's constant examples, people like Cassidy, right? People who were just nice on wax, and then they produce an album, and the industry just was like, like I didn't really know what to do with someone who was as talented as you are, but here you go. If Cassidy had used his same hustle, his same grind that he was on the sort of underground circuit inside of Philly, Beanie Siegel is another great example of this. It's a fierce MC that the industry always sort of messes up album projects with. If they use their, hustle and their grind to create institutions, record industry institutions inside of their independent labels, then we would be really doing something different about hip-hop. And what the industry was doing would not even be a focus for us. We would be much more interested in what the streets was able to sustain in a real viable and a real alive way.
And I wonder if you could talk a minute about the Hip Hop University. I know you're affiliate of, the person who started that, Lockie Raven.
Right, University of Hip Hop.
University of Hip Hop.
University of Hip Hop is all about Chicago public school systems and hip hop study inside of Chicago public school systems. So it has like a true sort of traditional hip hop studies bit. It's definitely modeled after what gets done inside of the academy, right? Hence University of Hip Hop, right? In terms of hip hop scholarship, it's true to sort of its commitment to investing in all the elements of hip-hop, right? So Lockie Raven is a graffiti artist, but also, making sure that they're studying what's going on inside of breakdancing, making sure that they're attempting to be young breakdancers and young graffiti artists, and it's really just fly, and it's all about the public school system. And what I like about it, which doesn't get done as well, I think, in other university environments, right, in other urban centers, is that it's not just about putting PhDs or people en route to their PhDs like myself in there as educators. It's also about just grabbing, the local mouthpiece in the community and putting them in there as educators and seeing what they have to say about hip-hop and what's important to them about hip-hop. And that's a good model. I think it's one of the best models I've seen in terms of a public school project completely invested in hip-hop, right? And so that's what University of Hip Hop is. I would encourage anybody to contact their organization, to contact Lockie Raven at Kenwood Academy if you're interested in doing like a seminar or even, getting more deeply involved inside of that project, because public school students, of course, are listening to hip-hop, and they're very interested in what hip-hop is producing, but they're also interested in intellectualizing about hip-hop. We had a group of young people that I worked with at Kenwood Academy, and this was separate from University of Hip-Hop, but I worked with them, and they spoke at the Hip-Hop and Feminism Conference in Chicago. They also spoke at Push Academy Conference. Push is the conference, so Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Push Organization Conference inside of Chicago. So they were down to talk about hip-hop and feminism. And almost nobody's down to talk about the F word, you know what I mean? So they're willing to intellectualize about hip-hop, and they're willing to integrate it into their curriculum.
And I wonder if, in your studies and in your research and in your discussions with other people doing similar work, if you thought about hip-hop as redefining what political is. And the reason why I ask that is because we always get into this discussion with friends in my circle, but also people who are skeptical of hip-hop's potential to really create change, have said, well, you should look at hip-hop as the artistic movement, but not as a political movement. Like, what is expressed politically? But I've always held the position that hip-hop forces a redefinition of what politics is. What constitutes politics for mainstream folk, for adults, is not always what the youth define as political. And there's ways that we can empower youth by helping to, channel their energy into more directly political movements and moments. But at the same time, it's important that they define what political means to them. And so there hasn't been a whole lot of space for that. And I wonder if you've entertained that, that's kind of redefinition of what political means in this context.
Right, absolutely. The folks that are going to critique hip-hop as being apolitical are folks that are pro-government, right, and folks that are pro-formal politics, right? So politics to a lot of people means voting. It's something hip-hop has to do more of, certainly, but that doesn't mean that we're not political. Politics to a lot of people means registering for your party and campaigning, during election years, right? That's something, again, that hip-hop started to do more of, particularly within the 2000 election, right? In our quest to end Bush, right? That's something that hip-hop started to do a lot of, but could certainly do more of. But hip-hop has always been a form of informal politics inside the black community, right? What politicians do is that they create messages for empowering people. Now, they empower them to do right things, they empower them to do less things, right? But that's what politicians do, right? Hip-hop has always done that, right? It's always expressed both regressive politics and progressive politics. It's always been there. And so maybe we're not, necessarily registering for our party. Maybe we're not campaigning like we should be, for Barack or for whoever, right? But we are invested in formal politics. We are invested in putting our ideas out there, our politicized ideas out there. We are invested in deciding what's progressive and what's conservative and what's capitalist inside of our society, what's communist, what's socialist. All these messages are there inside of hip-hop, but they're just informal politics. And instead of really presenting it as a sort of redefinition of what's politics, there's a tradition there, right, for informal politics that we've always had inside of the black community, right? We've always had protests, right? We've always had music as a sort of political arm that goes along with more formal political activity. If I'd like to see hip-hop do anything, I would like to see it invest in formal political messages that it's always had inside the culture as a arm, right, or create a bridge over to more formal politics, right? Because voting is important, particularly in our generation, right? Voting is incredibly important. However, we've always had informal politics. Slave songs, right, spirituals were a form of informal politics way before we had official governments in the sense that we know them now. So hip hop is definitely political. That's unquestionable, right? Hip hop is most certainly political. It's just that people who have very narrow definitions of what political means, people who think that that's just voting or just registering for your party, right, are not varied enough in what their definition of what politics is.
Trigger Radio. Yo, right now it's the one and only the D to the A to the VEYD, the one and only Davey D representing the Bay Area, hanging out with my folks on Trigger Radio. That's right, don't touch that dial.
Tune in to Trigger Radio on Valley Free Radio every Friday from 8 to 10 p.m. with Chris, Tone, and Rec for hip-hop music, hip-hop culture, and education. Peace.
My reality, I might die a local legend. Yeah, shout out my boy Blado. My impact, a F5 tornado. These haters get me, bet my peoples get revenge. Don't take this shit in vain, a needle and syringe. My niggas banging on them ratchets. They my sons like Phoenix, I claim them on my taxes. They say I'm a genius cause I seem smart. If it's war, we gon' ride like a theme park. We waiting to collide, y'all hold still. It's animals on this side, y'all roadkill. It was the summer of tears, y'all following steps. We the people under the stairs. Make powerful verses like I'm chanting the Bible. I'll end up in Cooperstown or Canton, Ohio. When it's all said and done, my movie came a novel. And when they talk about the greats, my name's in a convo. It's such a fucking pleasure to meet us, where they do lines for kicks but never Adidas. It's a black tie dinner and the wine's great. Since it's prime time, I might as well have prime steak. It's candle lit and my CD low. The chef preparing my dish, got a TV show. Yo, where we steam up, we blowing L, son. Where a nigga bust his hammer, but he get his nails done. And we even got manners, bag stacked with high notes. The feds say we living like black sopranos. Yo.
We living like black sopranos, sopranos. Don't wear numbers, but we run the streets, the streets. Hey, we're living like black sopranos, sopranos.
AP, you know I got you, nigga.
She's the everybody winning like
moves I make is like a black soprano. Yo, I got guns from Italy, pop bottles considerably, hydros out the 40, put a nigga out his misery. Ghetto penitentiaries, my niggas hold it down. Few locked behind the walls, got a few that's in the ground. Move weight through the town like a nigga want the crown. They wanna build you up, nigga, just to tear you down. But my DNA is MOE, money over enemies. Bag full of DOE with homicidal tendencies. Shots of that liquor, get the clapping with the blicker. No accidental murderers, my niggas meant to hit you. New Rollie, Lord ice on the bezel. They say time heals everything, I'm on another level. Yeah, twisting green like a Rasta. Tails of that lobster. Vodka white sauce over angel hair pasta. Moves like a mobster. Get it in, move it out the hood, know I gotcha. We keep them birds moving south. Yeah, black sopranos.
like black sopranos, sopranos. Don't wear numbers, but we run the streets, the streets. Hey, we're living like black sopranos, sopranos. She's the everybody winning like me.
Fly her around the world in a private plane. I could fill up her fingers with diamond rings. I could give her the cards with all the codes. It wouldn't matter cause she's seen it all before. She's by far no amateurs. She knows what she wants and she gon' get it. She acts like a lady, but she thinks like a boss. And I'm not intimidated, she's turning me on. That's what it sounds like. That's what it sounds like when she walks. That's what it sounds like. That's what it sounds like when she walks.
Jana ulinifurahisha, macho yako ukiniangalia, sema wanipenda pia, nami nitakulilia mara mia.
No need to compare her to any I haven't never seen before. She's a once in a lifetime kind of rare. I mean, she can hear my thoughts. I hear music when she walks. She's not a model woman, no, but she's the model woman, yeah. She's the prototype in every way. She's got it, and I want us to be. That's what it sounds like. That's what it sounds like when she walks. That's what it sounds like. That's what it sounds like when she walks. She's not a model woman, no, but she's the model woman, yeah. She's got it going on. She's got it going on, and she's got me up. Oh no. She's not a model woman. She's not a model, no, but she's the model woman, yeah. She's the model. In every way she's got it, and I want us to be. That's what it sounds like. That's what it sounds like when she walks. That's what it sounds like. That's what it sounds like when she walks.